Hello, everybody. Welcome in to the Couch GMs podcast. I'm your host, George Kerth, and Cody Roadcap and Tyler Snyder unfortunately could not be with us today, but that doesn't mean we don't have a special episode on tap for you. So, we have a special guest with us today from the Bang Your Head podcast. We got the one and only Jake Zimmers from a living room somewhere in central West Virginia, I think he likes to say. Jake, what is up?
George, what's going on, man? Thank you so much for having me on. Still in this West Virginia living room for the next few days before making the trek back up. But happy to take a break from the packing and the cleaning to hop on with you. So thanks again for having me.
Of course. Thank you for coming on to join me today to talk the exciting episode of fantasy defenses and kickers.
Hey,
But
listen
really, no,
to
we'll do
play
more
to
than
play
that.
devil's advocate. To play devil's advocate, right? I'm not. You can attest to this from being in a league with me for what 7-8 years now. I do the fantasy thing. I draft my teams. I keep up to date on the waiver markets. But you know just as well as I do, I'm not the most exciting person, especially in the trade department. So I mean, look, if we're talking kickers and defenses, it's the least sexy part of fantasy football. But hi, how are you?
They can make a difference in your league unless you're someone like Cody who thinks kickers should be outlawed, but we'll talk about that one later. Um, we're also going to talk to top stories of the week, and we're going to do a little fun segment at the end that we're going to save the name for till the end, but we're going to talk some underrated fantasy studs this week just to spice up the episode a little bit. You can find everything Couch GMs on our website, thecouchgms.com, and on our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the Couch GMs. We'll be posting some kicker and defense rankings this week, as well as who else knows what happens. There might be some big news like there was last week. But before we get into that, I think I want to get to know Jake and let you fans get to know Jake a little bit better. So I'm going to take a page out of your playbook, buddy. And I know you like to start your Bang Your Head episodes with one simple question. I'm going to turn around on you. Who is Jake Zimmers?
So what's funny was that when you sent me like the rundown of this episode, I had seen you put that in there, and I thought it was just like, oh, like he's taking a page out of my playbook, but like, does he know like how deep and introspective I get? So thank you. Who is Jake Zimmers? It's an age old question that after 26, almost 27 years, scientists may not even know. But to put it kind of, I guess, just out there, I am a uh, music lover, football fanatic, and somebody who's always trying to learn. To backstory on George and myself, we've known each other now for 7.5, going on 8 years. Which is crazy to me. We met during our time at Kutztown University, both from the I'm always going to call it electronic media. It's never going to be cinema, television, and media production.
Same.
It is always going to be electronic media. I will say EM until the day I die. But yeah, it was through my time at KU where the music nerd in me came out. Maybe not necessarily up there with the likes of Anthony Fantano from the Needle Drop, but the whole point of starting the Bang Your Head podcast was for me not only to learn about music and that maybe I wouldn't have known otherwise, but to also learn about the stories of my friends and my colleagues that I've been lucky enough to have in the at least the 4 years since we graduated from KU, and certainly during our time at KU. So I think that's the roundabout way of saying who is Jake Zimmers. I am simultaneously somebody and nobody. There's your deep answer.
I feel that from a deep personal level, honestly. But you mentioned Bang Your Head a little bit, your podcast. And it is nice that I do think there is a nice little, you have people telling their stories and being a little inspirational and being able to learn about some music along the way as well. So I think you do a much better job of explaining it as me. So what is Bang Your Head and why'd you start it? Well, you get to kind of describe why you started already, but feel free to go more detail.
Yeah, so the name Bang Your Head dates back to my time at Kutztown. Sort of towards the end of my time in high school, maybe my junior senior year, I'd gotten the idea that I wanted to get involved with college radio. I remember in the mornings, I would be getting ready for school, and my dad worked at 8 o'clock in the morning. My mom would be getting ready. Like, we'd all be getting ready at the same time. And when I'd be eating breakfast, I'd be in the living room. Usually my dad and I would be eating breakfast, and he would flip through the channels and find, it was sort of that weird time when all of the radio shows were transitioning into a television simulcast format. And for me, that really got started with Mike and Mike when they were on ESPN2. And then eventually, like, I saw news stations start to do it. But it's primarily been a sports thing, which, you see guys like Colin Cowherd on Fox Sports. Obviously, the ESPN stuff currently with the likes of KJZ and Greeny has his show back, and Max Kellerman and all those guys. And I knew when I got into college, I knew I was going to be an EM major. And at the time, I thought, oh, well, they were connected. I came to find out that KUR and electronic media weren't related. As was, like, some of my friends from KUR were comm majors. My good friend Pat Dietrich from the band Crooked Ways. He was a sociology major and got his master's degree in something that was not, I can't
Oh,
even remember what his was, but like he got his master's degree in something that wasn't even media production. So when I got to college, it may have even been during a like a visit when I was still in high school. I just signed up and wanted to learn more. I think I even found Mike Regg's email on the KUR website, and I just said, "Hey, uh, how do I do this?" And he said, "Go to the meetings." And it was all uphill from there. I was involved with KUR for 4 years. Bang Your Head relates back to there. Sorry, I went on a tangent. Anyway, I love KUR. But to transition it into
no,
the
you're good.
the podcast, I had the Bang Your Head show on college radio for 4 years, and that was sort of playing whatever music I want, which is the beauty of college radio. But when I had the idea to start the podcast for a number of years, and I had some times down here in West Virginia where I felt like, at work, I felt like I wasn't being utilized properly. So I wanted to try to find a better way to push out my creative outlet. So the idea sort of just came from that. And I reached out to my good friend, Bobby Sunday, who hosts the Quality is Key podcast. And I just asked him, like, give me an idea for a mic, give me like I want at least like a template to go off of. He provided me with that template. He was my first guest
Mhm.
when I released my first episode a little over a year ago. And yeah, every week, we're on a hiatus right now. Last episode I released was at the beginning of April, but the show basically explores my guests' career history, their life history, learning more about them, how they followed certain career paths. And we eventually turn the conversation to music and discuss their most influential album. So, I mean, reviewed, rock, pop, hip hop, metal, um, you know, pop punk, like a little bit of everything. And it's been great to hear all of these stories. And some of the episodes were fun and great. There were a few that we got really really deep on, which I also appreciate, because that's the whole point. You want to learn about people's stories, however comfortable they feel releasing, revealing that information. So I love this thing. This is probably the proudest I've been of a project since the college radio days. And uh yeah, eventually we'll get back into the swing of releasing weekly episodes. But it's a great time, and I love hosting it. I know one day we'll get you on, because I definitely want to hear the story of George Kerth. I might want to have all three of you guys on at the same time, and just pick one collective and just make it like the heaviest death metal album possible, and just read just like and just read about screaming lyrics.
I mean, some of those lyrics have to be the deepest lyrics you've ever heard of. You just don't understand them when you listen to them the first time.
Hey,
I'll make a bet.
you're not wrong. I mean,
But,
listen to a
definitely.
death metal band just say, "I miss my wife," but they're screaming gutturally, and you can't understand what they're saying.
It just sounds like a totally different meaning because in that emotional sense, you're thinking something completely different.
Right.
But, no, I mean, it's nice that the podcast platform allows you to be as open as you are, and there's so many different things, like, we're more of an informative podcast about sports and helping with fantasy football, but you can have the emotional standpoint as well, or it can be inspirational, or you can still be learning about music and all this other stuff, like you're saying, you have, like, a good little mix there, so I really do enjoy your show a lot. Everyone should go check it out. Where can we
Thank you.
find you quick?
Podcast is available wherever you listen. Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, see Pocket Casts. There's the main site, anchor.fm/byh pod. There's a Facebook page. The other thing I will promote, if you go to Spotify and search for the Bang Your Head podcast guest list, I have, I think, 3 playlists up right now, which contains every song, or as many songs as possible, rather, that I've either reviewed for the show, or each episode I like to feature an independent artist for an independent spotlight. I've had, the likes of, our mutual friend Zach Esposito and the boys in Crooked Ways. I've had their song spotlighted. I interviewed Zach on an episode recently, and I've had the likes of my good friend Pete Long and his new band, My Cousin's Girlfriend's House, and his previous bands, and uh, I've been lucky to meet a lot of great musicians. And that was another goal with this, was just to also promote independent music, and make people realize that, like, there's other music out there that's not, the mainstream stuff you can hear on the radio. There's so much great music out there, and you know yeah, so check out those playlists and check out the history of the show. There's, I think, over 30 episodes out there already, wherever you get your podcast. Check it out.
Awesome. Awesome. And shout out to Zach Esposito and Crooked Ways. I mean, that's probably the hardest metal you'll hear me listen to. So I don't think, if you do have us on, I don't expect any death metal album coming out of any of the three of us, honestly. But why don't we spin this a little bit back towards what we do before we move on to the normal show? So I want to know from you, how'd you get your start in fantasy football and why do you still play?
Well, you guys gave me my start in fantasy football, so thank you for that. That would have been 2013, I want to say. I just got a 2013 or 2014. I got a text message from one of you guys and said, "Hey, we have this guy in our league. He's not really, keeping an eye on his team. Do you want to take over?" And I just said sure. And I actually think finished off that season rather strong. Got a couple of wins at the end of that season, which was great. But sort of just
That team was awful.
just sort of, took off from there. I've been in the league with you guys. I think I'm entering year seven or eight, with you guys
Mhm.
in our league, as the aptly titled Jake from State Farm. And I'm also in 2 other leagues with some other friends from Kutztown. One is a redraft, one is a dynasty league that I inherited, and slowly curving into a much more competitive team. Although it always frustrates me, because dynasty was the one league where, like, I don't start a certain player, and if I do, they give me the win. And that's the one thing that happens so often, is sometimes it won't make a difference. I could have started this player that went off for 30 or 40 points, but I still lose. But a lot of the times it's like, oh, Miles Sanders had an off week, I'm going to bench him and start somebody else. And that's the one game that Miles Sanders decides to, put up 25, 30 points, and I end up losing by less than 20. So if I start him, I win. So, but yeah, that's sort of where it all started. I have one league championship to my resume, which came in 2016. Very competitive final week with Tyler. I think I only won that game by probably less than 2 or 3 points. I have a runner-up finish in one of my other my other Yahoo league, and yeah, man, it's a cruel mistress sometimes, but I love it, and it's become a huge part of my fall Sundays, much like it does for a lot of other people.
There's so many reasons that you could still play when it comes to either just finding more interest in the league, being interested in more games that you wouldn't be interested in. Like, I know you and I are Eagles fans. It's nice having another Eagles fan on this show because normally I'm just the one that's getting piled up on by the Packers and Titans fan over here. But it's nice that you can focus on more games that aren't just the teams that you root for personally on a Sunday, and then on top of that, you also have a bit of a community. Like, we were good friends before fantasy football, but I always like to think that brings it more together. And I mean, I would like to think we'd still talk sometimes if we weren't playing fantasy football together, but we're even closer now still
Oh, sure.
after college because we still have that connection. So I think that would be my biggest take for why you should play fantasy football would be those two things right there. Mostly even the community. Do some fun things in your league. We try to do fun things in our league of record, which is what Jake's a part of. And you've heard us talk about the league plenty. We still probably will. And now we can mention Jake by name, and you listeners out there will know who we're talking about, which is good. But
Yeah, I think
I think
that's
it's
it
time
too.
for
Is
us
that
to.
fantasy for at least us? Like I was gonna say, like fantasy, like for us, like it serves as a gateway, right? Like it's a
Mhm.
way for us. Like you mentioned, like 4 years after we graduated from college, like we still keep in touch, and yeah, sure, fantasy is a part of it, but at the end of the day, too, it's like that gives us that opportunity to not necessarily talk about other we're able to talk about other things, right? So it's been cool to like be able to have that sense, especially in our league. The I almost was going to say crazy. None of the people in that league are crazy, but I would say very dedicated fantasy fans that we have in the league.
Oh, we're all crazy in our own special way. You don't have to sugarcoat it at all. No, it actually brings me back to, well, before we move on. There was an ad campaign for NFL.com fantasy a couple of years ago that Tyler and I absolutely loved. And I mean that's the video nerd and us coming out a little bit too, but it was basically two friends talking to each other, and it was them talking about fantasy football. And then it would go on to a life without fantasy, and it would just be like standing there awkwardly next to each other, and then it goes like, "How's your cat?" So like the whole punchline was friends don't small talk, friends talk fantasy. So I think it really did kind of encapsulate the whole it's a community, it gives you something to help keep in touch with, and you do talk about other things. It's not just awkward outside of that, but it really is a good means to keep a good community and keep your friends close.
100%, couldn't agree more, man. And yeah, I listen. I know we're gonna have some fun topics. And listen, you brought me on for the most exciting episode possible, and that's totally not any sarcasm whatsoever. I love kickers and defenses. They're the best. They're the best. I don't care what Cody says. I love you.
Really, though, this show got spiced up a heck of a lot once something broke in the news a couple of days ago, and that was Julio Jones. The trade saga is over, and he got traded to Tyler's Tennessee Titans. And I'm a little bit upset he's not on the show to start bragging and talking about how they're going to the Super Bowl, but they actually might have a
Yeah.
shot. But anyway, trade details. Titans got Julio Jones and a 2023 sixth round pick. The Falcons got a 2022 second and a 2023 third. So it was a swap of picks in 2023 and then a second round pick going to the Falcons. There's a lot to unpack with this when it comes to us talking about how the Falcons had so many weapons. And there's no way they're going to be able to defend them. I still think that that's true because there's some sleeper wide receivers on that team, like Russell Gage, for example, who may now get a big boost without Julio Jones being in the house. And Calvin Ridley's had some absolutely insane games when Julio Jones was out of the lineup. So you could still see a really, really potent Falcons offense. But this mostly is a humongous step up for the Titans, who didn't have a wide receiver outside of A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown will still probably be a top 5 wide receiver. You bring in Julio Jones, who opens up that passing attack so much more, and you still have to put 8 guys in the box for Derrick Henry. They really might be Super Bowl contenders now, and I just want to see what your opinion is. Do you think that this hurts Julio Jones or AJ Brown's value, putting them both on the same team?
So here's the thing. First of all, talking about the trade itself, I'll be honest. Maybe I was in the minority here, but I was not expecting Julio to the Titans. I was much more expecting him to go to. I probably would have had the 49ers at the top of my list, just because with the Niners are one of the teams in the league that have the defense, but they just need to figure out the quarterback situation. I think they have a great running game, but they need that number one receiver. So I would have loved to have seen Julio go to the Niners and work with Jimmy G and eventually Trey Lance. Nevertheless, And also selfishly, let's be real, the Eagles have 3 first-round draft picks. Come on. I would have loved to have seen that. But anyway, uh, it does okay. I think the Titans, they wouldn't have been number 1. They probably would have been somewhere in my top 5. It's cool to see him go to the Titans. I think a lot of people are selling Julio off because he had one bad year, probably the worst year since one of his first couple of years in the league. Injuries happen, and I get that he's in his early 30s. I get it. But he's still like, he is a physical specimen, man. 6'3", can break double and triple coverage like it's nothing. Him and AJ Brown, I think already right there are one of the scarier receiving duos in the NFL. But the thing that's going to be interesting to see, Ryan Tannehill has revived his career in Tennessee. Obviously, Derrick Henry, I in terms of just a pure running back, he's probably the best in the game. I would say in terms of overall package, you could probably combine him with or
Mhm.
compare him and McCaffrey. But it's interesting because there's much like with any team that gets a lot of offensive weapons. There's only the ball can only go around so many times. So you're going to have Tannehill, who it's going to be interesting to see how he deals with, obviously he's going to have to feed the ball to Derrick Henry because he just signed that huge contract. He himself has a huge contract. They're bringing in Julio Jones, who's also on a huge contract. And oh, by the way, AJ Brown's entering his third year. He's still on his rookie deal. They may be able to have him for the next 2 years when they pick up his fifth-year option. But what's going to happen when he's due for it? Like, there's so much ifs, ands, or buts. But if we're solely talking about this year, Titans, man. Look, as long as Mahomes is on the Chiefs, I don't think, obviously they're going to be the team to beat. But I think the Bills and the Titans, I think, pose the biggest threat. Josh Allen's improved, and the Bills' defense is the Bills' defense. They're great, and we'll talk about defenses in a second. But with the Titans, man, Tannehill, Brown, Jones, Henry, um, even Jonnu Smith as who I would say, an underrated tight end, right? So, I mean, great, phenomenal.
So Jonnu actually did move to the Patriots,
Wow, see,
but
you
Anthony
can tell how often
Firkser,
I
we're
pay attention
huge
to
fans
news.
of.
So
Um,
maybe Jonnu's gone. Sorry, Snyder, I didn't mean to make you mad there. Take them out of it then. Still, Tannehill, Henry, Jones, and Brown. What can they do for you? Uh, I mean, it's gonna be a great offense to see for sure.
Definitely, and I think it's going to be one of those offenses you want pieces of in fantasy. It's not going to be one there's too many pieces that you're just going to get diluted. I think there's a lot of top end talent and maybe not much depth, which works very well for your fantasy team. Not to get confused with all those wide receiver trios we were talking about on the show 2 weeks ago and got really heated about. But anyway, moving on, just to give a little Aaron Rodgers update, hashtag Rodgers watch, as Cody likes to say. Rodgers is not attending Packers mandatory minicamp as we expected. Not a lot of other news. They still want him back. Rodgers says that it's all about integrity. There's nothing really new there. Hashtag Zach Ertz watch. Trade market still pretty quiet. So that pretty much wraps up our trade watches and now a big trade that happened this week.
I
But
will say one thing real quick about Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz is my one of my favorite players on the Eagles, alongside Brandon Graham, probably. Those are the two guys that I always identify as my favorites from that team. Look, last year for the Eagles was a tough year. Anybody who watched that team and made fun of that team on Twitter could see. But um, you know, I think it was weird, right? They had that video shot of Carson, Zach, and Jason Kelsey after the Washington game, um, which was in retrospect now heartbreaking, because obviously Carson's in Indy, and I'm going to be excited to see what he does in Indy. I'm always going to be a Carson Wentz fan, a stan, if you will. But with Zach, it's interesting. He's another guy, much like Julio, how, Julio was injured this past year a fair amount, and people are like, oh, he's old, we're going to write him off, blah, blah, blah. And look, I get Zach Ertz, he's had his injury problems, especially last year. I personally think Zach's going to come back. I really do. I think I'm hoping that the new coaching staff can instill a little bit of a fresh motivation, especially working with Jalen Hurts. Um, but the one team that obviously was floated around was the Bills. Um, I think I don't mind Dawson Knox. I think he's pretty decent, but I mean, it's let's not forget that the year the Eagles went to the Super Bowl, Zach Ertz was one of the top tight. He was probably the number 2 tight end in the NFL with Travis Kelsey. Let's not forget that one of those years, and feel free to correct me on this, 17 or 18, he broke he had the single season receptions record for a tight end. It was like 116 catches in a year. He at least had one or two seasons of over 1,000 yards, which still to me, even though it's more consistent for tight ends now with the likes of Kelsey and Kittle, even, we'll hopefully, Mark Andrews, even with the Ravens, let's see what he does this year. But I still love Zach Ertz. Maybe it's just me as a favorite player, but I think, if he has a fresh coaching staff, they give him a chance. We'll see what happens. It'll just be an interesting dynamic working with Dallas Goedert. But if he goes anywhere, I wouldn't mind him going to the Bills. I've always had a soft spot in my heart for the Buffalo Bills. I have family in upstate New York. So Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, Zach Ertz, and Dawson Knox as a number 2 tight end on that team. Come on.
That team's already scary. That I think would give them a big boost. It's funny. An Eagles fan with the exact opposite reaction of what I had last week. I thought Zach Ertz is gone. I'm high on Dallas Goedert. Obviously, if Ertz stays, we're gonna have a lot of interesting talk when it comes to tight ends, and that might dilute the tight end market a little bit with Ertz and Goddard doing more switching, and you don't know who's going to be the lead anymore. They might give Goddard the edge this year as opposed to Ertz, but we don't
I
know.
think the time to have done the
Um,
trade for Zach would have been during the draft. And, of course, the
mhm.
Eagles did a trade, but it was to trade back up to number 10 to get Devontae Smith. So, it didn't happen there. Maybe, like you said, it's a case where, uh, maybe they focus more towards Dallas Goddard and, Zach almost becomes the Brent Selleck, right? Like when Zach Ertz came in, he replaced Brent Selleck. Maybe now it's a
Mm.
case where Dallas Goddard comes in to replace Zach Ertz. It's like the passing of the torch, so to speak. Maybe next offseason he'll get traded. I think he'll be on the team this year, but hey, man, never say never in the NFL with the Rodgers stuff and with the recent Julio trade. By the way, conspiracy theory, I think it was Aaron Rodgers that punched Miles Teller in the face, but it's another story for another time. I think Miles Teller, as an Eagles fan, was like,
All
"Yo."
conspiracy
I think
theory.
Miles Teller is an Eagles fan because he's from the Philly area. Was like, Aaron, come on, man. Even trade you and some draft capital to the Eagles for Jalen Hurts and some more draft capital because the Eagles have 3 first-round draft picks. And I think Aaron Rodgers was like, no, bam. So that's just. I'm 100%. Look at my face. I'm 100% serious when I say that.
A couple weeks ago, he like Rogers was in Hawaii. I'm pretty sure he was with Miles
Oh
Teller.
yeah,
You're right. It could be.
yeah. I mean, and there was a story that came out that he was like at a restaurant and got in a fight with somebody. And some dude just literally walked up and slugged him in the face. Um, I'm not saying it was Rogers because it wasn't. I'm not saying it was. I'm just gonna put it out there in the ether, and you can decide with that what you will.
Well, maybe he'll need some pain treatment to take care of what that pain on his face, and it could be near the end of your favorite NFL players being fined for marijuana use because the NFL and NFLPA is now funding research for new pain treatments that includes CBD and medical marijuana. So everyone start sounding the Josh Gordon's coming back again alarm because that's the only reason he's been out of the league 7 times. But this is a good step. You're starting to see sports leagues that are starting to not fine for it. Like they might test for it and be like, oh, he has it, but they don't fine for it. You just get a slap on the wrist. The NFL has always been a 4-game suspension, I believe, since their new CBA when it comes to marijuana as well as other performance enhancing drugs. That might now change. This is not going to be something that changes this year. I heard it's like $1 million funding what do you call it, grant that will be awarded around Thanksgiving of this year. So it's something that might come up next year if there's enough scientific proof, or if not in the next few. But this seems to be where the country's going, and it's nice to see the sports leagues are now following along, as someone could get caught with marijuana in a state and not get in trouble, but then get a 4-game suspension from the NFL. It just seemed a little strange to the whole thing.
So, first of all, I would like this part clipped and posted to promote this episode, but I would just like to do my Stephen A.
Okay.
Smith impression and just go, "Stay off the weed." Okay, so that's not actually my opinions on the situation. Look, honestly, stealing a phrase like I heard Stephen A. once talking about a situation with D'Angelo Russell, who plays in the NBA with the Timberwolves, and he got caught with weed when he was going back to the Kentucky Derby, and he made up the good point. Listen, guys, this isn't coke, this isn't heroin, this isn't meth, it's weed. And I've always said that there's nothing, to me at least, there's no problem with weed. The issue comes with when and how you do it. Like if you're gonna wake up and you're gonna wake and bake before you go to a 1 o'clock football game, no, don't do that. That's stupid. And I know stories have come out in the past. Like I think Percy Harvin has said he's played games while high, and Calvin Johnson very candidly spoke about how during his career, like I don't know if he necessarily played when he was high, but that's how he would manage the pain to avoid getting addicted to very, very strong painkillers and opioids. Um, yeah, I think, to me at least, there has to be a good way to find a middle ground between smoking weed, eating edibles, however you want to put it, but find a way to do it where it doesn't affect your work on the field. If you're coming to the stadium high as a kite, and you get in trouble for it, yeah, you deserve to be, because if you want to smoke your pot, to me, do it during the off season, right? Do it during time when you're away from the facility. Don't do it in the hours before a game. Don't do it before you go out to practice. Be smart with it. And there needs to be a way for the NFL and the NFLPA to find that middle ground. It'll be hard. Like there's no question about it. I hope that there can be some sort of resolution, because I think that if we want to avoid players becoming dependent on opioids, especially as there is an opioid crisis in the country, I think the first step is to calm down, think logically, and try to find a solution to the weed situation, and even then the CBD stuff as well. You go into a convenience store and you can find CBD gummies and CBD cream and things like that. So um, yeah, there definitely needs to be a solution, and I hope that sooner rather than later the NFL can come to a resolution for this issue.
Hoping that this is the first steps to that. So let's move on to some of these exciting topics we got on deck here for today. First off, I don't think we're gonna spend a lot of time on this one. It's the kickers. So if you ask me, there are 3 guys you want to own, and 2 of them are from last year. The same top 2: Justin Tucker, Harrison Butker, for the Ravens and Chiefs. Those 2 most consistent kickers miss the least, especially if you're in a league like ours who makes misses be negative points. You want to own guys who are just accurate. You don't want them to hurt you, even if they might not have the best week now and again. They're not going to give you negatives. So that's Butker and Tucker. And then the third one who burst onto the scene last year is somebody who we've talked about plenty and I've had very bad stories with in the past, and that's Younghoe Koo. We've already heard my Younghoe Koo horror story in the fantasy playoffs 2 years ago, but he really broke out last year with the Atlanta Falcons. Was the most accurate kicker all year, if I'm thinking correctly. And yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to take a kicker before the final 2 rounds of your draft, please wait for the final 2 rounds of your draft to pick kickers and defenses. You can get so much other value at other positions before that. If you're going to take one before that, though, and you want to get an edge, it's either Tucker, Butker, or Koo. That way you're getting the edge at kicker, and you're just sacrificing it elsewhere. But Jake, what are your thoughts on those 3, or do you have anyone else you want to add to my group?
So I always go back to this fantasy draft check sheet I got from like 2016 or 2017, and one of the things it had once it got to like round 11 was like pick Justin Tucker or like the best available. So definitely
Yep,
agree. I still follow that mantra. Like I think it was in our draft last year. I think I picked Justin Tucker. It might have even been Butker. I can't remember. But I picked one of them in like round 11 or 12. And
it
I
was
remember
Bucker.
we
I got Tucker.
yeah, and everybody in our call was just like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, Listen, man, I'm following the draft strategy." Um, Here's the thing. I'm not gonna be like Cody and say that kickers like, come on, if you are in a tight game, right, and if you're down by 4
Mhm.
points and you have a kicker left and he nails a 60-yard field goal, you get 6 points. Tell me you wouldn't want that, because of course you'd want that. In regards to the kickers that you mentioned, yes, Tucker, because to me he's the new Adam Vinatieri. And first of all, shout out on the retirement of Adam
Mhm.
Vinatieri. He just announced that the other week. So congratulations to him on a legendary career. Um, to me, Tucker is, I mean, it's Tucker and everybody else. I was listening to your guys' discussion last week on the tight ends, and it was like Kittle, Kelsey, and then everybody else. And for me, like I think Butker is sliding
Mhm.
up there right now. I think as long as you're on a team with Patrick Mahomes and the offensive weapons that they have, you're always going to be kicking extra points. You're always going to be at least getting in that territory for field goals. So I think great, good, cool, Butker and Tucker, no question. Young Wei, I always pronounce it Young Wei Ku, right? Yeah, that's it. He's somebody obviously
Yep, you got it.
thank you. He was somebody that bursted on the scene last year, like you mentioned, most accurate kicker last season. He was an All Pro Bowler, and I think he's certainly going to be there. Like we mentioned earlier, the offensive firepower that the Falcons are going to have with Calvin Ridley and Kyle Pitts and that entire team. They're going to be scary. The one I initially thought of before settling on Koo was actually Aldrick Rojas from the New York Giants. He's somebody that always
Hmm.
popped up as doing good things. And I mean, I think he's had his struggles along the way, but I think there were times where he sort of picked it back up again and got back into the swing of things. He was somebody I always thought of as sort of on the climbing up that ladder. But like you mentioned, I think it's really you know kickers are a thing where you don't think about them because you really don't need them, but then when you need them, you're like, oh, they're necessary. So I think like you mentioned, if you can get Tucker, Butker, draft them before anybody else, like rounds 11 or 12, like if you think your team's already laid out, uh, to how you find it fit, then great. If they're not on the board, then wait until probably you know in a 16 round draft, probably towards the end of round 15 or 16. You could probably even go through a draft without drafting a kicker and just pick somebody up in free agency. I think kickers are always going to be there. They're always relatively accurate, but it's just a matter of who's going to be more accurate than others.
It's actually funny you mentioned the going through a draft without a kicker. I know if Cody was here today, he would be mentioning that because that is one of his biggest strategies. He always likes to take an extra wide receiver, running back at the end of the draft that could be like a flyer. If he hears good things, he'll keep him and try to drop somebody else for a kicker. If he doesn't, then he'll drop that person for a kicker after the draft because if you don't get one of the top 2 to 3, you're basically all in the same boat anyway. Someone you get off free agency is not going to be any different than someone you draft. So the other thing is every single year in the rule change ballot for our league, he always proposes that kickers should be nixed. You did tease a little bit, and it seems like you don't think kickers should be nixed. I completely agree as well. I feel like it's just starting to get too crazy. Like, not only is it that they say kickers should be taken out because they're just annoying and whatever. There's people that are starting to say that tight ends shouldn't be, or like there shouldn't be a designated tight end position. Like it should just be mixed in with flex, and it's because of the whole they say like, oh, there's 2 to 3 really good tight ends and then the rest of the field. But I think that is what adds a strategy to the league because then you're debating, do
Draft
you
better.
want one of
That's
those top
that's your
two kickers?
solution.
Do
Just
you want
draft
one of
better.
those? Exactly. Do you want one of those top 2 kickers? Do you want one of those top 2 tight ends? because that'll give your team an edge as opposed to the field? Or do you just want to sit back and cry about it because you didn't want to go out there and make that move, or you didn't build your team around it well enough to make up for the lost points for those kickers or defenses that may struggle? Yeah, no, I definitely think it should stay part of the game of fantasy football because it's a big part of the strategy. The strategy is not just your top 3 picks in the draft. It's building an entire team as a whole, and those middle to late round picks are what wins people drafts most of the time. It's not even the top 3.
Here's something I'll say too. I look at kickers almost as like an NBA sixth man of the year because they can give you 15 on a good day, like give you 15, 16 points off the bench and can influence the decision of the game. I'll bring up a really rare instance because I don't you could probably count on one hand the closest it's gotten to since. But it involves one of Tyler's teams, obviously the Titans. There was a game a number of years ago where the late kicker Rod Baronis, he the Titans,
Rod
yeah,
Baronis.
the Titans were playing a game against the Texans, and the Titans won the game 24-21 because Baronis kicked 8 field goals. Like, if you have an instance like that, 8 field goals, some of them were probably over 50 yards. Like, that's a lot of points. Like, it's rare, I get it, and like I said, like that's one rare example. But you're gonna tell me, think about it if you don't have kickers and you end up losing a game by 3 points. And if you did have Justin Tucker who scored 10 points, well then, you win by 7. Every player in fantasy is important for a reason. Um, Rich Eisen has the whole, the punters are people too thing that he does every year. And you know what? Screw it.
Pat McAfee for the brand.
Pat, yeah, dude, for the brand, FTB. Um, Kickers as well, man. Come on, you. If you don't have them, you're gonna cry that you should have had them. So, Cody, please get your attitudes about kickers and curve them a little bit, my friend.
Amen. Cody, I hope you're listening to this afterwards because you need to learn a thing or two from Jake here. But the other position that could be maybe overlooked and frustrating in fantasy would be defenses. So in this year, I feel like there's a consensus top 5. I still wouldn't draft them as early as maybe those top 2 kickers. Maybe look at like round 13 if you're trying to get one of those top defenses. And after that, wait till the end of your draft. But few teams I wanted to just spotlight would be the LA Rams, Baltimore Ravens, Pittsburgh Steelers, Washington football team, please get a name, and Indianapolis Colts. So a lot of those teams are repeat offenders from last year. Those 5 teams finished in the top 6 in defenses last year. The one that we did not mention that was in the top 5 would be the Miami Dolphins, who basically won games with their defense and a lot of scoring. But I feel like that a lot of that was a couple of weeks in the middle of the year when they first put in Tua. They had a couple of games where they scored multiple defensive and special teams touchdowns, kind of bumped their numbers a little bit. But they're still a solid defense. They're probably someone you'd want to draft in the top 10 in defenses, but I'm not in the top 5 for me. Anyone in that group you want to highlight or anyone you want to add to that there, Jake?
Well, in that specific group, I mean, okay, so the Rams are always going to be there when you have a guy named Aaron Donald on your defensive line, the guy that's won 3 of the last 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards. Yeah, he's arguably the best player in football. If he causes havoc, then that gives opportunities for the linebacking core in the secondary to step up. The Ravens have always been a defensive minded team, even dating back to when they won the Super Bowl with Ray Lewis back in 2000, and obviously, I mean, look, that defense is scary good. Steelers, TJ Watt to me last year was my defensive player of the year. I thought he had a great season. And you have a tremendous defensive line and Minka Fitzpatrick, who went from purgatory in Miami to one of the best defensive backs in the NFL. No sneeze at either. Washington football team, they snuck up and I mean, so much focus on the defensive line though over the past few years. Ryan Kerrigan's obviously gone. He ended up with the Eagles, but Chase Young, Jonathan Allen, I think you have some good you have a good defensive line core there, and they're young. I think that's another thing of it too. Like Chase Young is entering his second year, and a lot of guys here that are first round draft picks that have all been drafted, relatively recently. The Colts, the Colts on both sides of the ball have molded their team extremely well. On offensive side, they get the O line situation figured out. Unfortunately, Andrew Luck retires, but it'll be cool to see what they do this year with Carson Wentz. On the defensive side of the ball, Darius Leonard is a linebacker that I feel like he gets a little bit of recognition, but nobody talks about him enough. To me, he's one of the more underrated defensive players in the NFL, a tackling machine. Adding on to the list in general, and looking at the defensive things you mentioned, the Dolphins, um, and the Dolphins kind of reminded me of the Chicago Bears from a couple of years ago, and I'll put the Bears in there because as long as Khalil Mack is on your defense, he's just as disruptive to me as Aaron Donald. Maybe not as disruptive, but at least he that fear factor of always like, oh, you have to pay attention where he's at, otherwise, you're gonna have a rough day if you're the quarterback. I remember a couple of years ago, the Bears were they didn't I don't think they made the playoffs, but they had a top 10 defense, and I saw that and I was like, wait a minute, well, why didn't they win more games? Oh yeah, because Trubisky was their quarterback. So that makes sense. Looking here at the top 10, the Saints, Cameron Jordan, another defensive line force, is someone to look at. The Patriots surprised me here. They were ranked seventh in points allowed. I mean, Stephon Gilmore, he was the one guy to break Aaron Donald's streak of Defensive Player of the Year awards when he won in 2019. And I know there have been rumors about him being traded. I think he's one of the best corners in the game. The Buccaneers, I mean, listen, man. Your quarterback is Tom Brady. All you got to do is stop, and you win. That's what that's shown. I mean, uh, Levante David has been somebody extremely consistent over the past 5 or 6 years. Um, Jason Pierre-Paul, a guy who showed promise in with the Giants, obviously had the hand injury, and he has surprisingly been doing fairly well. And yeah, I think there's a lot there, man. There's a lot there, but I think certainly the five that you mentioned there are the ones to look out for. And I think if the Dolphins stay on the right path as well, they'll be scary as well. Xavier Howard, come on.
And I think the biggest thing to look at when you're talking about what team defense you want to grab in fantasy would have to be sacks and turnovers are the key. And that basically goes along with the name drops you put down there. Aaron Donald, even if he's not getting sacks himself, the fact that he's drawing double and triple teams means that the Rams defense gets more sacks. Plus, just putting pressure on the quarterback means more turnovers. Ravens are a suffocating defense that may not get the most sacks, especially because they had to rebuild their front seven, but they get so many turnovers in the secondary, interceptions, and they're one of the best teams at forcing fumbles. Washington has the amazing defensive line. It seems like it never ends, even if you rotate guys out. Like that's what you're always looking at. Like points for is big because you don't want to lose points for them giving up points, and you want to see a team at least middle ground or better in points allowed. But teams that can get all those turnovers are where you get your bread and butter points in fantasy football. So like having those big names that will instill fear even is going to make offensive lines play them different. And that's why you're going to see other guys that may not be those top guys coming in there and getting all these sacks and turnovers because they're not worried about them for whatever reason it might be. I just want to ask a quick question to you. I already know my answer. I'll say it afterwards. Would you rather grab one of those top five defenses, or would you rather wait till the end of the draft and what we call stream defenses? So get somebody late who might have a good matchup in week one, and then just start playing matchups off the waiver wire.
That's the one part of the waiver wire that I typically try to avoid unless I have a bye week. So I think if you're set on a defense at a certain point and you can get them, I say go for it. I think obviously if you're gonna have, you know, we don't give defenses and kickers the love, and during bye weeks you can get by without them. I've never been like that. I for the longest time on my dynasty team, I had, I think I still have two defenses, like just because you never know if it just depends on the matchup week by week. If you have that roster space, maybe pick up that second defense. Maybe I'm in the minority in that camp, but you have to play that guessing game, because if you unfortunately have to settle with a subpar defense that will get you either no points or even worse, negative points, like that's obviously not going to help you. So I would say if you're settled on a defense in the draft, go for it. If you have your offensive lineup set, pick that defense, because it could be a pivotal key for your season.
I agree with you, actually. I would rather have that defense that I could set and forget basically my lineup besides bye weeks as well. Um, I've never been one that has luck with streaming defenses. I'll pick up that defense that's playing the Jets and they happen to just basically not give up any points but not do anything otherwise and finish the game with 7 points, where it's like, well, I could have got 7 out of anybody else anyway. It doesn't really matter. As opposed to them going off big for that 20-point week that you're expecting because they're going to get a defensive touchdown and 3 interceptions and a fumble. So I would rather go for that top defense who I know has the boom potential, because you're going to stream defenses in good matchups, but maybe they just aren't built to get turnovers or put up all those things that you need to get fantasy points. Eagles are a good example of that from last year. They had a bazillion sacks, but they were worst in the league in turnovers and they gave up a pretty decent amount of points. So like, you're going to pick them up in a good matchup, but they might not do great for you because all they're going to do is get sacks. I would rather have that consistency of that set and forget in my lineup.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think you have to have that well-rounded defense. And you mentioned the sacks there. And if you have the right defensive linemen, like Aaron Donald, like Khalil Mack, and you afford that time for your secondary and your linebacking core to get better matchups, then I mean, then you're set in stone. But in the case of the Eagles, like you said, Brandon Graham was a Pro Bowler last year. Didn't amount to anything because the Eagles only won 4 games and they couldn't keep the defensive outburst going. Right. So like sacks aren't the only thing. Um, so yeah, I mean, it has to be a well-rounded defense. You can get that well-rounded defense, definitely go for it. Um, if not, I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be a top tier defense. Go with a solid defense that maybe will surprise you. If you get somebody that's just on that fringe of being a top 10 defense, get a couple good weeks in you, they're going to have a great season.
Definitely agree. So why don't we move on to something that might be a little more exciting? And I wanted to kind of bring this segment back around to music and what you do a little bit here, Jake. So, what is the member in a band that does not get the love it deserves?
Drummer, it's the drummer. I'm a drummer, it's the drummer. 100% drummer.
So, if that being said, I'm going to name this segment Fantasy Drummers. We're going to be talking about players who make a big impact on their team and on their fantasy team, but never get the love they deserve. So, we're talking some underrated fantasy stud assets. I'm going to have us all, but each do 3. We can rotate here. So, I'll start us off here. My number 1 fantasy drummer would have to be Melvin Gordon. A lot of people are not giving any love to Melvin Gordon this year because they went out and drafted another running back. And obviously, everyone's all focused on their young and powerful passing attack. But I don't love their quarterback situation. I would like it better if they put Teddy Bridgewater in, but he's going to have to earn that job. And they're going to have to lean on the run game. So until I see Javonte Williams, their rookie running back, come in and really take all the carries, they're going to have to give Melvin Gordon a lot of the work because he's the big money guy that they brought in on the huge contract. And he is still proven to be an effective running back. He's not going to be an RB1, but he has a chance to be a RB2 if he gets enough work. So underrated, is going to carry that offense a little bit. Melvin Gordon.
Okay, so I'm going to save my biggest one for last. It was funny when you gave this idea to me, and thank you for paying homage to drummers. We're the best. I think that I look at like personal connection to like my fantasy teams in the past, right? So the first guy that came to mind for me, and I'll give a slight spoiler alert, all three of these guys are, uh, I may even need to add a fourth one, but I will give, the first couple I thought of were all wide
Okay.
receivers. So the first one that came to mind to me was John Brown, who's now with the Las Vegas Raiders. He's a guy that, um, he to me, he was part of a very solid receiving core. I think you can make an argument one of the top receiving cores in the NFL last year with the Bills. Him, Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, and you had Stephon Diggs who had a great season. Obviously, you had Cole Beasley who nobody talked about because but he was a second team All Pro and had a tremendous season. John Brown's always been a guy, and it dates back to his time with the Cardinals, which I think was when I first picked him up on my dynasty team. Is a guy who comes in clutch. Like, he is a waiver wire pickup machine. He is one of the fastest receivers in the game. He can get you. He can have some great games. He has helped me out of some binds, and I don't think he gets as much love as he deserves because he's played. He had a shot in Baltimore and had some success there, but like in Arizona, he was with Larry Fitzgerald. In Buffalo, as I mentioned, he was with Beasley and Diggs. So it'll be interesting to see what he does in Vegas with the receiving core there. Obviously, Ruggs out there entering his second year. That's going to be scary. I think that's a really underrated receiving duo. Maybe I put too much on John Brown, but I love John Brown, and I will always be a fantasy football stan for John Brown.
I'm actually with you. I'm low key a John Brown guy as well. And we've seen them bring in veteran receivers the last 2 years, and they've actually come out to be fairly decent fantasy players. 2 years ago, it was Tyrell Williams. Last year, it was Nelson Aguilar. Now it could be John Brown. We'll see if some of the rookies try to jump in and take that spot, but John Brown should get the first look, and nobody's talking about him. I love that pick. Number two is somebody that is a little bit more on people's radars, but somebody that always is trying to be replaced. Somebody who nobody really seems to trust for whatever reason. And my number two is Chris Carson. Every single year, the Seahawks are trying to replace him. Every single year, he's falling down draft boards because everyone's worried about question marks. And every single year, he finishes as a top 15 running back. And I don't get it. When are they finally going to stop the charade? When are they finally going to put their trust in Chris Carson? And then we can actually appreciate him as a top 15 running back as opposed to worrying about him and drafting him down near the 20th running back and then watching that person who got that steal reap the benefits.
That's a good shout. My second one, and you're 100% right. Chris Carson, uh, he is, yeah. I think the whole theme for drummers being underrated, that he's certainly an underrated guy, and it's funny because the Seahawks always add the, I was big on Rashad Penny when the Seahawks drafted him, and he hasn't done much of anything. Travis Homer is there, or at least he was there, and but it's Chris Carson. I mean, you're 100% right on that. The second one for me, uh, how he is not in the discussion of best receivers in the game shocks me. Jarvis Landry. Um, I look at Jarvis Landry and you look at he's been in the league now. I think he's entering his seventh season. Nobody talks about the fact that he's made 5 Pro Bowls. Nobody talks about the fact that I think in 2017 or 2018, when he was still with the Dolphins, he led the league in receptions. Nobody talks about the fact that since he's been in the league, he's been one of the top pass catchers in the game. Like, he has something like he has like it's absurd how many catches he has. But because he plays on a team with Odell, obviously Odell is going to get the recognition. And I get Odell is a fantastic player, but here's the thing. Would we be talking about Odell if it wasn't for that catch in 2014 against the Cowboys? I get that he's had a couple of great seasons. I get it. And maybe people don't take Pro Bowls into an account. I still appreciate the fact if you're recognized by your peers as a Pro Bowler. I think that's significant. The guy hasn't made a Pro Bowl since 2016. The guy hasn't made an all-pro team since around that same time as well. And I get injuries are a part of it too. he's had some good years and maybe hasn't been recognized, but consistently in and out with as good as he is as a number two, like Jarvis Landry, man, he's a pass catching machine. He's amazing. I've picked him up in drafts, and he's helped me. I think the past couple of years I've gotten him on a couple of my teams because he's a PPR machine, and I think he doesn't get the respect that he needs.
I agree with that too. And I was one of the people that was not high on Odell when we were talking about wide receivers here. So thank you for agreeing with me and saying that. And I think having Odell back helps Jarvis Landry because it's going to take some pressure off of him as opposed to last year. He was playing wide receiver one, which I mean, he was still effective. But I think he's better going against the second corner on a team, just racking up 10 catches in a game. And there's not much around him else at wide receiver besides Odell, which I don't love the outlook of Odell. So great pick there for your second. I'm going to go to my third, and then you can even say your third and fourth if you'd like, because you said you might have
Okay.
four. My third, I'm going to go to the wide receiver department like you, and I'm going to go with Panthers wide receiver DJ Moore. So there's so many people on that team that are just like, oh, it's Christian McCaffrey, and that's it. DJ Moore has been consistently hanging around that wide receiver two flex conversation for the last how many years. And now they got rid of Curtis Samuel, who I think people seem to enjoy because he was that gadget player last year. He could line up outside. He was getting carries at running back when McCaffrey was out. And because of that extra work, obviously he might have been even a bigger fantasy asset. But DJ Moore was always there as that consistent target. And now we have Sam Darnold coming into the mix, who I get it. He likes Robbie Anderson. I do like Robbie Anderson's outlook because they played together before. DJ Moore is probably a better talent than Robbie Anderson. So don't forget about DJ Moore in your drafts. You can get him as he slides down the draft board, and he might be able to slot in as a wide receiver two or a stay in flex for most of the season.
So before I give my third, which I don't know if it would be a surprise to have that guy on my list, um, because the stats would say otherwise. I would like to give an honorable mention to a guy who has helped me, who I think is extremely underrated. He had a down year last year, but he was on all of the most recently great New England Patriot teams that won the Super Bowls over the past few years, and that's James White. James White to me is a leader on that offensive side of the ball. Maybe not necessarily as a rusher. One of the things I noticed, especially with my dynasty team, was that you know my running backs are also really good pass catching running backs. Like I have Miles Sanders. I had a trade this past offseason, which I forgot to mention earlier because it revolved around the Julio news. I actually traded AJ Brown and Antonio Gibson to a team and got in return Juju Smith-Schuster and Christian McCaffrey. So my top two running backs right now are Miles Sanders and Christian McCaffrey on my dynasty team, which is not a bad get. But with regards to James White, um,
Mm-mm.
I love James White. Like I despise the Patriots like the majority of America, but James White was always one of my favorite players on that team because he was to me, he was to the offensive side of the ball what a guy like Matthew Slater was to the special teams unit with the Patriots. Consistently hard worker, team leader, and is great. And hopefully he can pick back up again if the quarterback situation can get figured out. But the third guy that I'm going to mention officially as underrated, and he shouldn't be, right? Because he has a big contract. I looked up his stats, and last season the guy had 92 catches for over 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns. So you think, oh, well, how does a guy with those stats be underrated? Because maybe some of those stats came in garbage time. Maybe it's because he's not as flashy as an Odell Beckham, who everybody talks about. He's not as fast as Tyreek Hill. He's not a big possession guy like Michael Thomas. The man's name, and I hate his team, but the man's name is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper is, for my money, at the very least, top 10 wide receiver in the game. He didn't have Dak last year. I think with Dak coming back, ever since he was traded from the Raiders to the Cowboys in 2018, he's been one of the best receivers in football, in my opinion. And I use the NFL top 100 list, and he gets on that, and good on you, man. But looking at his, I'm looking here at his stat lines. 2018, he split between the Raiders and the Cowboys, and the guy finished with 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns. And I think he made the Pro Bowl. 2019, his first full season in Dallas, nearly 1,200 yards receiving and 8 touchdowns. Last year, as I mentioned, 1,100 yards receiving and 5 touchdowns. The guy, it wasn't even that he was a bust with the Raiders, but in a really weird sense, he resurrected his career, because I think he may have been out of the league had he stayed with the Raiders. But they traded him to the Cowboys, and he's consistently been like, it's because he has these games where he might only have 1 or 2 catches for 20 yards, but then all of a sudden he has a game like he had Thanksgiving, was it a year or two ago against Washington, where he went off for something like, for well over 150, maybe close to 200 yards, because he had 2 big touchdowns. Like, Amari Cooper, man, just he. All three of my picks were wide receivers. And maybe Amari Cooper is a bit of a reach, but I don't think he gets the respect he deserves, because everybody always talks about Dak, Zeke, the defense with the Cowboys, and Jerry Jones. Maybe Amari Cooper likes it that way because he's a quiet guy. Cool. Amari Cooper's amazing.
Honestly, you're talking to the right person if you're going to say that Amari Cooper's underrated, because I am the person who doesn't really love Amari Cooper and doesn't love the fact that there's 2 other receivers that were high draft picks there with him. But you're right. I mean, he's been consistent. He has, yeah, there's nothing I can argue with, really. I mean, I worry about drafting him as high as maybe some people might want to because of all the other things around him. But if you can get him sliding down the draft board, it is worth it. You're right. I might still avoid him, but no, that might be a fault in mine as well.
Well, let me ask you this real quick. If we talked about currently the drummers of football, right? The underrated players. I've had a player in mind in the history of the NFL, who I'd like to get your opinion on, because he's a guy that nobody talks about. And I actually also like you to provide me. Who would you consider an all-time football drummer, an underrated player that nobody talks about?
Killing me. You're throwing the hard ones at me now. Um, hmm.
I'll tell you what. I can give you mine. I can give you mine, and I can get you, I want your thoughts on this. And I'd like to,
Okay.
before I reveal his name, I would just like to provide um the info on this guy, because he is, and I'm sorry to say, it's another wide receiver. But he's a guy that nobody talks about because of who he played with. In his career, this man played for 4 teams. He won a Super Bowl in 2012 with the Baltimore Ravens. In his career, made 3 Pro Bowls and set receiving records that some still hold up to this day. Others have been broken by the likes of Odell and Julio. Nobody talks about him enough because his teammate was one of the greatest, is still, I mean, he's still playing, one of the greatest wide receivers of all time. They were drafted in the same draft. Nobody gives Anquan Boldin the love that he deserves. You look into the stats of Anquan Boldin. I wrote this down once. I think he was top 20, 25 all time in receiving touchdowns, and top 20 in receiving yards. But to me, the most telling stat, he is 9th all time in career receptions. He has over 1,000, nearly 1,080 career receptions. He's not only one of 14 guys all time with at least 1,000 career receptions, but he's 9th all time. He's 9th. And yeah, I get it. Fitzgerald is ahead of him, and Fitzgerald is great. And you have Jerry Rice and Randy Moss and all these guys. Great. But God, nobody talks about him I didn't truly appreciate it until I saw him in Baltimore, and then even eventually in Detroit and San Francisco. And I was like, oh, this dude had like 1,000 yards, 1,100 yards, and he's playing really, really well. And then you look at his stat line and you're like, wait a minute. like he's better than the narrative because nobody's giving him credit. So for me, Anquan Bolden's got to be is personally my pick for maybe one of the most underrated players in NFL history because I mean the numbers don't lie, man. Numbers do not lie.
You're right, actually, and I remember back in the times of my young days of fantasy football. I mean, I started playing back in like 2009, 2010, and he had a little bit of a lull in there near the end of his career in Baltimore, but especially when he went to San Francisco in 2013, he was a valuable fantasy asset. You're right. And like, yeah, putting up over 1,000 yards and 6 or 7 touchdowns a year, no one wanted to give him credit, even when he was away from like Larry Fitzgerald, because they're like, oh, Anquan Bolden, that's not a sexy name at all. But he was effective. You're right. I mean, that's not somebody I would have thought of even, but you make a great point.
So I tried to stall that out long enough to see if you can come up with a good answer. You got something for me?
Look at some stats here for you here, actually. So he's a guy I love,
Okay.
and I've mentioned him plenty of times on the show,
Okay.
and you're going to hear me rave on about him again. So Miami is where running backs went to start their career and die, it seemed like. Or when you went down there, their team was never that good. So, like, oh, you never got the credit you deserved. So there's multiple different Miami running backs you could think of right now that I'm talking about. But I'm going to go back to the beginning of this whole cycle of running backs who escaped Miami and were effective for a while. And that's Lamar Miller.
Okay.
Lamar Miller didn't really play much in his rookie year, but as soon as he started getting some playing time in 2013, he was averaging around 900 yards a season in his last 2 to 3 years in Miami. Went on to Houston, had 1,000 yard rushing season. And again, in Houston, no one really cared about him. Houston wasn't really a fantastic team yet. It was around that time that they got Deshaun Watson, if I'm thinking correctly. And then after that, they started to become a powerhouse. Still ran for almost 900 and 1,000 yards the next 2 years, and then just fell off the face of the earth. No one wanted him anymore. And I always talk about the disrespect of running backs in this league and how there's always so many guys who they're saying, oh, it could be their offensive line made them look better than they are. And people are putting a lot more assets into the offensive line saying, we don't care who we put at running back behind them. They're going to have holes. They're going to run through it. Lamar Miller, I feel like, was always underrated. He was playing on teams that were subpar and still putting up big numbers. I really wish I could have seen him on a team with a really good offensive line or even a better offense around him, and to see him get those 250 carries a year that when he got 1,000 yards, he might have been pushing 1,300 if he had a good offensive line in front of him. So he's my underrated stud, and I will defend Lamar Miller till the day I die.
Lamar Miller's a good shout. I think, and one of the other things that hurt him was unfortunately the injuries because I think he
hmm
could have been on the cusp of being that next tier, you know, really really solid running back, and then he unfortunately had an injury, and then he came back from that injury, and just it just wasn't the same. So, but no, Lamar Miller is a great shout. Maybe that's a future thing, creating the ultimate drummer team of underrated fantasy players.
I love it. We'll give the drummers the credit they deserve at some point. You're another one,
Let's
Jake.
go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on. But before you go, I want to ask you one more
Yeah.
question, and I want you to hit me with your favorite fantasy football story or memory from your time playing.
Whew. Wow. I mentioned it earlier, but I think it was that the year that I won the championship against Snyder. Just because I was going into that, and I remember specifically it was a Christmas Day game in 2016 between the Cowboys and the Bills, and his team was done. He was up by a few points, and I needed Cole Beasley to get something like 1.2 points, like a 2 yard reception, and I'm good. And it took until the fourth quarter, but he got me 3.5 points, and I squeaked by, and I won the championship. That's one that sneaks out. I can tell you from last season, if I'm going more recent, I had a game last season where, and it dates back and it relates back to Amari Cooper, but I had him starting on a Monday night game against the Cardinals, and the Cowboys got destroyed, but Andy Dalton threw a garbage time touchdown to Amari Cooper, and I went from being down 4 to up by 2, and I ended up winning that week. So anytime you can get those garbage time points that gets you the win, that's not a bad moment.
Awesome. That's good to know. And I mean that when you're down 1.2 points, that is one of the worst feelings in fantasy football, especially knowing that, oh, I know my player's going to bust today. If they do it in the first 5 minutes of the game, you're like, oh, this is fine. But if it, once it gets past that, you just start having the doubts roll in your head. What's going on? He's not in the game plan today. Fantasy is stressful for sure.
100%, and I wouldn't want it any other way. Just limit your amount of teams, because I think there was one year I had at least 4 or 5 teams and it burned me out. Just stick to a set number.
Definitely. Thank you so much for everything today, Jake. Your insight. You're just coming to join us, talking to us about yourself and fantasy football. Is there anything you want to plug again here before we go?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's cool being on a podcast and just talking about football. This has been great. So thank you. Yeah, like as I mentioned earlier, check out episodes of the Bangerhead podcast wherever you get them. Check out the music playlist on Spotify. If you search for my name, Jake Zimmers. If you want to follow my exploits on social media, Twitter and Instagram at JMZ1994. Check out the Facebook page for the show, and got some things we're working on. Mainly this week is cleaning up the Central West Virginia apartment that I've lived in for the past 3 years, and making the trek back to Pennsylvania to start my next adventure. But it was cool to take a break from all that and get into talking about football. So yeah, man, thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much, Jake, and you're welcome back anytime. Please keep in touch, man. And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. And this is where Tyler would normally tell you to get involved. So make sure you tell us if you like some of Jake's takes, if you didn't, if you hate my hair. I don't know. Tyler's better at this than I am. And let us know on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the Couch GMs, and visit thecouchgms.com for more info on what we talked about today and everything Couch GMs related. So, for Jake Zimmers of the Bang Your Head podcast, I'm George Kerth, and we'll see you all next week.